There are names spoken in the Imperium with reverence, others with fear, and a rare few that carry both weight and warning in equal measure. But none echo with such silent finality as the Adeptus Custodes. They stand at the threshold of the Imperial Palace like living verdicts, their auramite plate glimmering with the memory of 1,000 fallen ages. They are not the Emperor's bodyguards, they are his will made manifest, sharpened into the golden edge that never dulls. And yet, there are those who defy them. Some out of ignorance, some out of desperation. Some because fate, in its cruel mathematics, places them in the path of beings no mortal was ever meant to confront. What happens to them is not always recorded. But the void between official records is a graveyard of stories, fragmented, censored, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence. If the Custodes ever permit a soul to live after meeting their eyes, it is only because the outcome serves a purpose known only to them. And in that narrow margin, between obedience and annihilation, lies the truth of those who dared, willingly or not, to stand against the Emperor's golden sentinels. Tonight we walk into that margin. As we open this sealed account, tread with care. Knowledge like this is seldom offered twice. If you wish journeys like this to continue, across forbidden halls, lost vaults, and the shadows cast by the throne, it helps more than you know to leave a like, share these chronicles, and subscribe so the archives remain open to you. The gates of the outer Terra precincts rose before me like the ribs of some ancient, slumbering titan, vast arcs of adamantine and ceramite, layered in centuries of soot, incense, and ceremonial lacquer. Even from a distance you could feel them rather than see them, the way a storm can be sensed long before the clouds gather. The air around those walls carried a pressure that tightened the skin, as though the very atmosphere knew it was trespassing. Every data slate I'd ever signed warned me never to step toward this direction without sanction, but the routes had shifted. The usual checkpoints were sealed after a riot further down the transit lines, and I'd been told, rather plainly, to make the delivery or not come back at all. It was the kind of order men like me didn't argue with. Not because of loyalty to the Imperium, but because poverty has a way of breeding obedience far more effectively than devotion. The wind that curled along the approach road tasted of metal and old promethium exhaust. It carried the muffled clang of distant manufactura and the faint hymn chant of laborers beginning their shift cycles. Lights flickered across the skyline like cold stars, each one marking another spire whose peak pierced Terra's toxic cloud layer. But none of it mattered, not really. Because once you stepped within sight of those forbidden walls, the world lost its shape, its noise, its ordinary rhythm. The silence became absolute, a silence that wasn't simply an absence of sound but the presence of something immense and watching. I kept walking, clutching the sealed data vessel against my chest. It was small enough to disappear in my palm, but it felt heavier with every step. Rumor said that anything you carried into the Custodes' territory became known to them instantly. They didn't need scanners or wardens or servo skulls fluttering about. Their senses were something else, something woven into their blood, their armor, their purpose. Some transporters joked that the Custodes could hear a heartbeat change pitch from a kilometer away. Others said they could read guilt from the air itself. I'd always dismissed such talk as tavern exaggeration, until that morning. For a long while nothing happened. I walked. The stillness pressed in closer. My boots scraped the stone in a rhythm that suddenly felt too loud, too invasive. Even the hum of distant generators seemed to fade, swallowed by the oppressive quiet that blanketed this stretch of the Imperial Palace's outer domain. Then, as I neared the shadow of a colossal Aquila relief carved across the wall, the air shifted. Very slightly. As though something vast had turned its attention toward me. I stopped. The silence didn't break, it thickened. My pulse hammered inside my throat, each beat sending a faint tremor down my arms. I glanced left, then right, half expecting to see a patrol servitor trundling toward me. But nothing moved. The road was empty enough to drown in. The shadows along the wall seemed unchanged. And yet, I wasn't alone. A presence had entered the space with me. Not footsteps. Not a figure. Not even a breath of disturbed air. Just the unmistakable sensation of judgment, cold and immediate, sliding along my spine like a blade made of thought. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move again. My instructions were clear. Pass through the transit corridor, deliver the vessel to the administratum annex, and exit swiftly. It should have been simple. It had always been simple. But simplicity doesn't survive contact with the Custodes. The first glimpse of him came the way lightning appears within a storm cloud. More felt than seen. At the far edge of the road, where the shadow of a pillar met the golden haze of a sunrise struggling through Terra's polluted atmosphere, a shape emerged. Not stepped. Not approached. simply resolved into reality, as though he had been standing there all along, patiently waiting for my mortal senses to catch up. His armor gleamed like burnished dawn, every plate flowing with inset filigree that seemed too intricate to have been crafted by human hands. The aura might radiated its own light, faint but unmistakable, illuminating drifting dust motes like tiny comets suspended around him. A guardian spear rested at his side, held with the relaxed certainty of a being for whom violence was as natural as breath. His helm was carved into the stern visage of a forgotten emperor, its vox grill silent, its eye lenses fixed upon me with unblinking scrutiny. A custodian guard. One of the 10,000. The stories never said how tall they truly were, but standing before him, I understood why measurement was pointless. He wasn't just taller than any man I had ever seen. He felt larger than the space he occupied, as if the world had been forced to expand to contain him. My throat tightened. I tried to speak, to offer whatever identification code might delay whatever destiny I had triggered, but no words came. Something within me understood instinctively, explanations didn't matter. Intent didn't matter. Mistakes didn't matter. I had stepped into a place where judgment was absolute. The custodian raised one hand, not threateningly, not aggressively, but with a slow, sovereign gesture that halted my breath as surely as it halted my movement. The air around him pulsed with a quiet resonance, a hum I could feel more than hear, vibrating through bone and blood alike. He spoke. Only one word. And it was my name. Hearing my name on his lips felt like a blade sliding against the fragile membrane separating the living from the forgotten. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even a voice in the conventional sense. It was a vibration, a recognition embedded into reality itself. My legs shook, not from fear, but from the sudden, unbearable clarity that I was utterly seen. Every lie I had ever told, every corner I had cut, every shortcut through forbidden zones, all of it had been catalogued by this being whose presence seemed to warp the world around him. I raised the data vessel slightly, a weak offering of compliance, but the movement felt childish under his gaze. Time dilated. The ambient hum of the manufactorum in the distance, the distant clang of hydraulics, the faint hiss of venting gases, all of it fell away until there was nothing but the custodian and the space I occupied. For a fleeting heartbeat, I imagined that even the very stones beneath my boots quivered in recognition of him. The legends spoke of this effect, mortal perception bending under the weight of beings who carry the Emperor's will. I had laughed at the stories once, as all young couriers do. That laughter had long since died in my throat. Then, with deliberate precision, he lifted his spear. Not an attack, but an invitation, or perhaps declaration. The shaft reflected the pale sunlight filtering through Terra's clouded sky, each inlaid rune flickering like a heartbeat. I understood instinctively. Every step I took from here on would be measured, scrutinized, remembered. The custodian did not chase. He did not negotiate. He observed. An observation in their case was as binding as any prison. I swallowed and moved. One step. Then another. The road stretched endlessly, or perhaps it only seemed so, as if the custodian's presence had rewritten distance itself. My breaths came shallow, yet I could feel every intake vibrating against some hidden current that seemed to trace my spine. I imagined the lives of men who had encountered such judgment before me. They were not always found again. Some were. Some disappeared quietly, their records sealed in layers of bureaucracy that no human hand dared pry. I had always believed in fate, but now I wondered if it was only a framework the custodes permitted for mortal comfort. We passed the first checkpoint, an inert arch of blackened adamantium, scorched from centuries of ceremonial fire, untouched by human hands for decades. The custodian made no sign, gave no word. Yet every servitor and automated turret we passed seemed to pause, as though sensing the command radiating from him. I realized then that I was not merely walking beside a warrior, I was moving through an extension of the Emperor's will, and every instinct I possessed screamed that a misstep, a hesitation, or even a thought could be fatal. As we continued, the shadows shifted differently here. Not cast by the spires or the pillars, but by something older, something that predated even Terra's oldest districts. The custodian's shadow fell over me, yet it was not my shadow. It was an absence of everything familiar, a vacuum in which the human mind flinches because the natural laws it relies upon are bending. I sensed that the air itself had weight here, thickened by centuries of ritual and unspoken authority. My mouth was dry and my palms slick, but I could not stop. I had no choice but to follow, though following felt wrong. I was not leading myself through this path. He was, and I was merely a vessel of observation. Eventually, We reached the edge of a service corridor that led toward the administratum annex. Here, the walls were etched with liturgical markings, barely visible beneath layers of grime and decades of automated cleaning protocols. Servos and machinery flitted in the corners of my vision, their routines slowed, almost hesitant, as though acknowledging the presence we carried. And then I saw the first of the effects that no data slate or imperial record could truly describe. Subtle distortions in reality, fleeting glimpses of the impossible. Light bending around the custodian's armor, reflections in polished panels that didn't match the angles of the corridor, and a faint echo of voices, prayers perhaps, or whispered histories, wrapping themselves around him like invisible chains. I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on me, though only one face, hidden behind golden helm and perfect geometry, was truly watching. And I knew, as any man might know in such moments, that my every action, every twitch of my muscle, every heartbeat, was recorded in ways no mortal mind could comprehend. I had entered a realm where the normal definitions of justice, punishment, and mercy were meaningless. Here only observation existed, and the custodian, patient and eternal, was the arbiter. The corridor ended abruptly at a massive vault door, its surface engraved with the imperial aquila and dozens of administrative seals. Normally, I would have presented my clearance codes, banged on the access panel, or called for verification. But I didn't. I simply stood there, trembling as the custodian raised a gauntlet hand toward the door. It swung open silently without sound or warning, revealing the inner sanctum of the annex, bathed in cold, artificial light. And as I stepped across the threshold, I realized the truth of what I had always ignored. There is no negotiation with the Emperor's chosen. There is only acknowledgement, compliance, and the fragile illusion of survival. And somewhere, in the distance, the echo of my name lingered as if reminding me that nothing, not even the walls of Terra, nor the layers of bureaucracy I had relied upon, nor the promises of fate, could ever truly protect a man who has been seen by the golden guardians of humanity. Inside the annex, the air was thick with incense and the faint tang of machine oil. Servitors moved in endless, mechanical choreography, their limbs articulated with a precision that mimicked human grace but lacked any true consciousness. Their eyes, red lenses, tracked my every motion, though I knew the real observer was still behind me. The custodian had not entered, yet his presence filled the space more completely than any man or machine could. It was as though he had folded the corridor around himself, carrying the weight of inevitability into every corner, every shadowed alcove. I approached the delivery terminal, my fingers trembling as I prepared to interface the data vessel. Normally, this would have been a simple procedure, a transfer of encrypted data, a verification sequence, a brief acknowledgement of receipt. But the machinery seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before. Screens flickered at my presence, vox grills whispered in static-laden murmurs, and even the mechanical arms that moved to receive my delivery hesitated, as though aware of the custodian's gaze. My pulse accelerated, each beat hammering against my ribs in a rhythm I could not control. One wrong motion, one careless touch, could unravel everything. Not just my life, but the life I had thought I understood, structured, mundane, predictable, was no longer guaranteed. The transfer began, slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the machine itself feared the consequences of failure. Every byte, every segment of code that slid into the archivum was now a testimony, not just to my diligence, but to the fact that I had survived this long in the golden shadow. And while I waited for the process to complete, I could feel it. The custodian, unmoving in the doorway, a figure as eternal and absolute as the Emperor's throne itself. I wondered briefly what he saw in me. Did he see a courier, frightened but dutiful? Or did he see the sum of every choice I had made, every moral compromise, every act of cowardice and courage woven into a life lived on the margins of the Imperium? I had no answer, and I suspected that even if I did, it would not matter. When the terminal finally accepted the vessel, the subtle shift in machinery was almost imperceptible, yet it resonated through me like a distant thunderclap. A soft vibration ran up my arm, a confirmation of completion, and the servitors resumed their work as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had shifted. My place in the world had changed, whether I understood it or not. The custodian remained unmoving, a silent sentinel whose power did not depend on display but on the certainty of presence. And yet, as I turned to leave, I sensed the faintest shift in his posture, a single imperceptible tilt of the head. Recognition. Or perhaps curiosity. It was impossible to tell. As I stepped back into the corridor, the cold light of the annex gave way to the hazy, polluted sky beyond the walls. My boots struck the stone with a new awareness of sound and weight. I was alive, yes, but marked. Even a fraction of the custodian's attention was enough to rewrite the ledger of one's existence. I could feel it in the hum of distant machinery, in the unnatural alignment of shadows, and in the subtle pulse that seemed to follow me with every step. The streets outside were crowded, yet I was alone in a way that no human crowd could remedy. Every glance, every whispered prayer, every furtive look from a fellow citizen seemed to acknowledge what I had survived, and what I had become. Seen. Not yet judged, but seen. I did not speak for the rest of the walk back through the outer precincts. Words felt irrelevant, even dangerous. Even the most mundane noises, the clatter of distant manufactorum gates, the hiss of venting promethium, the faint drone of a passing shuttle, became a chorus to which my heart responded like a drum of warning. Behind me, I could almost feel the custodian's eyes, steady and absolute, shaping the air itself. I understood, with the clarity of desperation, that survival here was not a gift, but a calculation. And every calculation, every microsecond of hesitation, could tip the balance from existence to erasure. By the time I reached the edge of the forbidden zones, the golden figure had not moved. I dared not glance back, yet I could feel his presence imprinting upon the very fibers of my being. Somewhere in the recesses of my mind, a single, unshakable truth had taken root. To be seen by the custodes was to be remembered, and to be remembered was to carry the weight of an unspoken covenant with the Emperor himself. Whether this covenant offered mercy, judgment, or something beyond comprehension, I did not yet know. But I would carry its memory for the rest of my days, as one carries a brand invisible to the world but searing to the soul. And in that moment, the silence of the Golden Guardians became a voice, eternal and unyielding, speaking without words, claiming without touch, and marking all who dared enter their path. The labyrinthine corridors of Terra's lower under-habs were a world apart from the austere perfection of the outer precincts. Here, the air carried the acrid scent of chemical runoff, burnt cogwheels, and the faintly sweet tang of overcrowded humanity. Narrow walkways clung to walls lined with corroded conduits, their flickering lights casting fractured shadows that seemed alive, moving with the rhythm of the city's hidden heart. The courier moved cautiously, every step measured, every breath a prayer that the custodian's attention would not follow him beyond the outer precincts. Yet, despite the distance, he could feel it, a lingering presence that had not abandoned him. The golden sentinel's gaze had become a weight pressing invisibly against his shoulders, and each corner he rounded seemed to echo with silent observation. Rumor was the lifeblood of this underworld, spreading faster than the gears that drove the manufactura above. Every whisper of a custodian sighting sent entire districts into rigid, calculated stillness. Merchants froze mid-transaction, servitors paused mid-motion, and the unseeing eyes of the city seemed to turn toward the unseen observer. The courier knew the stories, men and women who vanished for years, only to reappear as relics of impossible transformations. Those who survived encounters with the 10,000 often bore subtle marks. A certain gait, a pause in their speech, a way of looking at the world that betrayed the memory of having been weighed. And he felt those marks beginning to etch themselves into him, invisible but undeniable. He ducked through a side passage, the walls slick with condensation and the residue of chemical vapors. A flickering data lamp revealed the desperate faces of citizens who rarely dared look beyond their immediate survival. Their eyes, wide with fear or reverence, followed him, though he knew they could not truly see him. They saw only a shadow of what was to come, a warning whispered down generations. To attract the attention of the Golden Guardians was to flirt with forces beyond mortal reckoning. And in the faint glow of the lamp, he imagined those generations' warnings converging into a single eternal gaze that measured his very soul. He reached a small alcove, a cramped space where a handful of refugees had carved out temporary sanctuaries from discarded machinery and broken data slates. They whispered among themselves, but their voices trembled. The courier, clutching the data vessel, realized that secrecy here was only an illusion. Terra's lower levels were a nest of rumor, and rumor carried farther than loyalty, bureaucratic seals, or even the Emperor's own vigilance. The custodes did not need to pursue directly. Their presence alone ensured that all corners of the city bent to their perception. Every alley, every chamber, every stagnant pool of water reflected their inevitability. And he felt it pressing closer with every step. The refugees spoke in hushed tones about disappearances, of citizens who were taken for reasons they could never understand. Some said the custodes were agents of judgment, enforcers of moral and bureaucratic law beyond human comprehension. Others whispered of impossible trials, of moments where time itself seemed to twist in the corridors the Golden Guardians traversed. The courier listened, nodding subtly, though he could not truly convey his own experience. Words were useless here. Language was a fragile vessel, incapable of carrying the weight of what he had seen, of what he had felt. Even the faintest attempt at explanation could invite disaster. From the shadows, a faint metallic hum approached. He froze, the pulse of his heart hammering in his ears. But it was not a custodian. It was a scout servitor, its eye stalks rotating methodically as it recorded his presence. The drone passed, indifferent yet precise, a reminder that the machinery of Terra did not sleep. He exhaled slowly, though the relief was fleeting. Somewhere beyond these walls, beyond these narrow passageways, the golden sentinel waited, not with hostility, but with the unyielding certainty that only the Emperor's chosen could embody. To walk these streets under that shadow was to live in perpetual tension, to feel the delicate threads of life and death weaving through each choice. The courier continued, moving deeper into the under-habs where sunlight, or anything resembling it, had long since vanished. The walls closed in, carrying echoes that distorted his own voice when he dared to speak aloud. Each reflection, each shadow, each subtle change in airflow became a potential signal of observation. He imagined the custodian at the far end of each corridor, measuring his every move, noting the alignment of his body, the cadence of his steps, the honesty or deceit embedded in his posture. Survival was no longer about agility, wit, or luck. It was about resonance, about moving in synchrony with forces that could not be seen, only felt. And in that suffocating electric quiet, he realized that the custode's judgment was not punishment in any human sense. It was an awareness, a calibration, a living measure of mortality itself. The Golden Guardians did not act out of wrath or mercy, they acted out of absolute purpose, and to be seen by them was to be integrated into a system beyond comprehension. Every nerve, every instinct, every trace of fear became data, woven into the tapestry of the Imperium itself. To flee, to hide, to negotiate, all of it was inconsequential. The only choice lay in acknowledgement, compliance, and the hope that the unseen arbiter found the human vessel adequate. The corridors of the under-habs twisted in ways that defied rational geometry, as if the city itself were aware of his presence and sought to obscure him. Low-hanging cables trembled with the vibrations of distant machinery, dripping condensation into shallow puddles that reflected distorted fragments of the flickering lights above. Every step echoed unnaturally, and he could not tell if it was his own footfalls or some deeper resonance from the structure itself, a heartbeat synchronized to a cadence beyond mortal comprehension. The custodian's shadow lingered at the edge of perception, not in sight but in sensation, an immutable pressure bending the world around him. It was impossible to ignore, yet he could not see it directly, only feel it coiling like a serpent at the periphery of awareness. He ducked into a narrow alcove, brushing against rusted conduits and the scent of decayed machinery. Voices drifted faintly from deeper tunnels, fragmented and urgent. The people here were whispering, careful not to speak too loudly. They were survivors, yet their survival carried the weight of obsession. Stories of those marked by the Golden Guardians, of couriers who had vanished only to return days, months, or years later as shadows of themselves. Some spoke of recruitment, others of judgment, and some hinted at things the mind could scarcely frame without cracking. He listened, recording these hushed confessions with a careful, measured attention. Each anecdote was a warning, a map of peril not written on data slates but in fear itself. The courier's thoughts strayed to the data vessel, its contents seemingly trivial against the gravity of what had occurred. Yet even that small parcel had drawn the custodian's focus, and that realization chilled him to the bone. To be seen was not a matter of action but of consequence. He had acted in ignorance, yes, but ignorance did not grant clemency. The Golden Guardians measured the weight of intent and execution, balancing every choice against a scale that only they understood. He could feel it pressing against his conscience now, an invisible hand evaluating every impulse, every misstep, every flicker of hesitation. A faint mechanical whir alerted him, and a servitor scuttled past, its motions fluid yet eerily deliberate. The drone's eye stalks tracked him, yet he sensed no malice. It was as if even the city's machinery recognized the custodian's presence and deferred accordingly. Every shadow seemed to retreat, every beam of light subtly shifted to accommodate a gaze that did not belong to any mortal observer. He realized then that the custodes did not need to pursue him to control him. Their attention alone reconfigured the environment, reshaping perception and instinct alike. Survival became a delicate art of anticipation, not avoidance, and he was learning it the hard way. As he moved deeper into the twisting underways, the stories of the lower habs residents began to coalesce into a terrifying pattern. Couriers, mechanics, laborers, those who had encountered the Golden Guardians and survived bore marks invisible to the eye. A twitch in the jaw, a certain tilt of the head, a hesitation before speaking. Subtle signals that something in them had shifted. They were no longer entirely human, nor were they wholly unaltered. Their memories contained gaps, small omissions that could not be explained by stress or forgetfulness. He wondered whether he too would emerge as such a vessel, marked by observation yet still walking among men. The corridor narrowed further, forcing him to move in a single-file line past rusted maintenance conduits and dripping pipes. The hum of distant generators reverberated through the walls, and he imagined it as a heartbeat in sync with the custodian's attention. Each step required a conscious calculation: speed, cadence, posture. One wrong movement could attract focus, and he dared not imagine what that might entail. The stories in the alcoves had been warnings, yet nothing could truly prepare a man for the sensation of being measured by a being whose existence defied judgment itself. Then, at the junction of two impossibly long tunnels, he glimpsed a flicker of movement ahead, a shadow that did not align with the dim glow of industrial lights. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. The weight of inevitability pressed down upon him again. He could not tell if it was the custodian advancing or merely a trick of his mind, a residue of fear manifesting in the flickering light. Either way, he felt the pulse of attention tighten, like a cord pulling him inexorably toward confrontation. There was no escape here, only progression, only the understanding that to be seen meant to be evaluated, and evaluation was a current stronger than any physical barrier. The courier moved forward, each footstep a negotiation with the invisible force that shadowed him. The under-habs stretched endlessly, a maze of decay and desperation, yet the custodian's presence imposed an order onto the chaos, bending corridors, shadows, and sound to a rhythm he could barely comprehend. He realized with a cold certainty that he had become a participant in a system far greater than himself, a cog in the machinery of observation that the Golden Guardians wove wherever they passed. And somewhere in that realization, a quiet terror settled, not of death, but of understanding. He had entered a domain where perception itself was as lethal as any weapon. The deeper he went, the more the under-habs seemed to pulse with life independent of his presence. Pipes groaned like ancient lungs, and the faint hiss of venting promethium carried through narrow tunnels, tangling with the acrid scent of burned resin and industrial runoff. The corridors seemed alive, a network of steel and shadow stretching for leagues, yet every inch resonated with the invisible weight of the custodian's gaze. Even when the sentinel was physically absent, he could feel the environment bending subtly, shadows stretching unnaturally, the hum of machinery synchronizing with the unspoken rhythm of judgment. He stumbled upon a marketplace tucked into the side of a collapsed maintenance bay. Makeshift stalls leaned against rusted girders, and merchants hawked mechanical components salvaged from wrecked servitors and broken Vox terminals. The residents eyed him warily, glancing behind their shoulders with each whispered conversation. Rumors traveled faster than light in these depths, and the name of a courier recently seen near the outer precincts would already have reached ears willing to hear, and those who feared the custodes most keenly did. A child darted between crates, her eyes wide, reflecting a fear he recognized. A fear not of death but of being noted, observed, marked. A knowledge that the unseen eyes were eternal, patient, and absolute. He avoided interactions, moving through the marketplace as silently as possible, yet every rustle of cloth, every displaced object, seemed magnified. The custodian's presence, though unseen, felt omnipresent. It was not the hunting of a predator, it was the quiet, inevitable certainty of law made flesh. Even now, the courier realized the Golden Guardian did not need to engage him physically to impose control. He could not hide, for the custodian's awareness reached into corners where light and shadow blended, into recesses of thought and hesitation, into the faintest tremor of the heart. The city itself had become a lens for the sentinel's judgment, bending perception and action into patterns that served an unseen order. He paused briefly at a junction, inhaling sharply through a nasal filter that did little to mask the smell of rust and decay. The voices here were softer, whispers too hurried to form coherent sentences. One old mechanic mumbled about those who returned, noting a strange distance in their eyes, the hollow certainty of having been touched by something beyond mortal reckoning. Another spoke of a courier who had vanished for weeks, only to reappear at the outer manufactura, perfectly intact but forever altered, carrying no memory of his passage yet radiating a subtle, unspoken authority. Each story reinforced a singular truth. Survival was a narrow path, and the custodian's observation was the measure against which it was judged. The courier pressed onward, moving deeper into the bowels of the under-habs, guided by instinct and the faint traces of data streams that led towards safer quarters. His thoughts drifted to the purpose of the delivery he had just completed. In the larger scheme of the Imperium, it was minor, a small vessel of information meant to traverse bureaucratic channels, but here it became a symbol of exposure. The act, insignificant to the administratum, had placed him in the custodian's scope, and the ramifications were incomprehensible. Every corridor, every shadow, every hushed conversation was now refracted through the lens of that gaze. A sudden clatter in the shadows made him jump. His pulse spiked, but it was only a scavenger drone, skittering along a nearby passage with the purpose of collecting debris. Even this trivial motion felt magnified under the weight of awareness. He understood then that in this domain nothing was trivial. The custodian's judgment extended to intention and perception as much as action. To misstep, to hesitate, or to act ignorantly could alter destiny itself. He was not merely walking the corridors of the under-habs. He was navigating an invisible calculus imposed by a being whose very existence defined inevitability. As the tunnels twisted toward an area partially reclaimed by the refugees, he sensed a shift, a narrowing of space both physical and psychological. Here, survival demanded cunning, subtlety, and the careful management of attention. Every decision, every micro-expression, was noted by forces he could not fully perceive. He could feel the custodian's presence pressing upon him, not through sight or sound, but as an extension of the city itself, a constant measure that would not relent. Even as he ducked into shadowed alcoves, weaving between the makeshift shelters and discarded machinery, the knowledge of observation was absolute. It was a reality more binding than any lock, any guard, any weapon. And yet, amidst this suffocating tension, a strange clarity emerged. To be seen by the custodes was not simply to risk death. It was to be weighed, measured, and catalogued into the fabric of the Imperium itself. Every step, every heartbeat, every thought became part of an assessment invisible to the human mind but unyielding in consequence. And as he pressed forward, deeper into the twisting, claustrophobic heart of Terra's underworld, he understood that the Golden Guardian's influence had already begun to shape him, whether he wished it or not. Each corridor, each whisper, each shadow was a thread in a tapestry woven by forces beyond comprehension, and he was irrevocably entangled within it. The deeper he moved, the more the corridors seemed to conspire with the weight of perception itself. The walls, slick with condensation and layered with grime, reflected not only the faint glow of flickering lights but also the echo of every step he had ever taken. It was as if Terra itself had become a hall of mirrors, each reflection refracting the certainty of the custodian's gaze. He realized, with a jolt of clarity, that the under-habs were not merely physical spaces. They were extensions of the vigilance imposed by the Golden Guardians, domains where even the faintest misalignment of action or thought could ripple into consequences beyond comprehension. A cluster of laborers huddled near a venting pipe, their faces etched with fatigue and fear. They whispered, their eyes darting toward the darkness where no light reached, and yet they knew. They knew, even without seeing, that the custodian's attention could travel further than mortal senses. Some spoke of people who had disappeared for months, only to return speaking in strange cadences, repeating liturgies they could not recall learning, moving with a precision that betrayed a life altered by observation. The courier felt the chill of inevitability brush against his spine. He was now woven into the fabric of that unseen influence, and each step carried the weight of 1,000 silent judgments. As he passed through a particularly narrow junction, the echo of distant machinery began to distort. The familiar clanging of servitors, the hiss of vented promethium, even the muted groan of overhead conduits seemed delayed, warped, as though the corridors themselves bent to accommodate the scrutiny he carried. He paused, breath caught in his chest, listening to the subtle cadence that now accompanied him, a rhythm he could not see but could feel in every nerve. It was an awareness that pressed in, insistent yet unseen, a constant reminder that survival was no longer a matter of skill or cunning alone. It was a matter of being adequate under observation, of being sufficiently aligned with the inscrutable standards of forces beyond mortal reckoning. The courier ducked into another alcove, pressed against the cold metal of a service wall. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the data vessel as though it were a talisman, though he knew it offered no protection. From the shadows, the soft hum of another drone passed, its red eye stalk scanning mechanically, yet even this machine seemed deferential, moving as though it were aware of the invisible weight he carried. Every detail, the flicker of a light, the vibration of a pipe, the direction of a shadow, was heightened, magnified into significance by the knowledge that he was being measured in ways he could barely comprehend. To be seen was not merely to survive, it was to be transformed. As he pressed onward, the labyrinth of corridors narrowed further, each turn revealing spaces that felt impossibly deep, corridors that seemed to extend beyond reason, and stairwells that spiraled into darkness without end. He realized that this underworld of Terra was not random. It was a living reflection of the Imperium's vigilance, a network designed to test, observe, and shape. And in that realization he felt both awe and terror. For the custodian was not simply a guardian of walls or a sentinel of halls. He was the embodiment of purpose itself, and to be marked by his presence was to be drawn inexorably into that purpose. By the time he reached the edge of a partially reclaimed sector, a quiet market of refugees and scavengers, he understood fully the subtle power the custodes exerted over life and perception. Those who had survived encounters with the Golden Guardians did not speak freely, yet their gestures, the faint alignment of posture, the almost imperceptible timbre in their voices, told the tale of a force both omnipresent and immutable. Every action in his path, every breath, every pause was subject to scrutiny, an invisible ledger in which he had been inscribed simply by being seen. And though the sentinel had not pursued him into these depths, he knew that the effect of observation was already complete. It had altered the very way the world responded to him. In the silence that followed, he realized that the custodian's attention had become a shadow not merely over his body, but over his mind. Thoughts were no longer private, hesitation was no longer inconsequential. The corridors themselves seemed to whisper his failings, reminding him that he was part of a system in which observation equaled influence, and influence equaled survival. And somewhere deep within that realization, a single, unshakable truth settled over him. To be seen by the custodes was to exist in a perpetual state of awareness, a tenuous balance where every choice carried weight, and the faintest misalignment could shift destiny itself. The courier emerged from the labyrinthine under-habs into a narrow, dimly lit thoroughfare, where the faint glimmer of distant street lamps struggled against the thick, polluted fog of Terra's lower districts. The air was heavy with the scent of metal, incense, and decay, a sensory reminder that he had left no place untouched, no shadow unexamined. Even here, far from the outer precincts, he felt the echo of the golden gaze, a presence that did not move but bent reality itself. It lingered in the unnatural stillness of the streets, in the subtle alignment of shadows, and in the hushed, knowing looks of those who had learned, by experience or rumor, to recognize what could not be seen. Every alley he passed carried the imprint of stories half-told, couriers and laborers who had encountered the custodes and returned, not merely alive but altered. One old woman crouched in the doorway of a collapsed hab unit, muttering prayers under her breath, her eyes darting toward him with a mixture of fear and reverence. She spoke of a man who had walked these same streets weeks prior, only to vanish beneath the custodian's observation, returning days later with the precision of thought and movement no mortal should possess. "They see everything," she whispered, voice trembling. "Even your hesitation, even your breath, is theirs to measure." The courier nodded subtly, knowing she did not need to see the truth. He bore it in every tremor of his body. He moved onward, glancing into the windows of abandoned dwellings, where shadows flickered like ghosts. Some of the citizens who remained had long since learned to communicate without words, to transmit warnings and observations through posture, glance, and subtle gestures. It was a language forged by survival under the weight of unseen judgment. The courier understood now that to be marked by a custodian was not only to be measured, but to become part of a living ledger, one that recorded more than action. It inscribed intent, thought, and even the capacity for fear or courage. Those who had been seen were transformed into instruments of observation themselves, carriers of the golden presence in ways they scarcely understood. He paused at a junction, hearing faint footsteps echoing off distant walls. They were not his own. His heart quickened, and he instinctively pressed himself against the cold metal of a service conduit, breath shallow. The footsteps were careful, deliberate, not mechanical, not human entirely, but measured in a way that bespoke training and purpose. The courier dared not look. He had learned that even acknowledging presence could invite judgment. And yet, he sensed that the newcomer was not a threat. Rather, it was another individual, one who had survived the custodes' observation and carried the marks invisible to the uninitiated. A subtle aura of certainty surrounded the figure, a silent confidence born from having been weighed and permitted to continue. It was the faintest comfort amidst the suffocating certainty of scrutiny. They passed each other without a word, the courier noting almost reflexively the way the other moved, deliberate, precise, aware of every step, every micro-expression, every heartbeat as if each was visible to a hidden observer. He understood now that survival in this city, under the shadow of the Custodes, was a matter of internal discipline. Every motion had weight, every hesitation was noted, every action reflected an invisible scale against which the human spirit was measured. And in that realization he felt a strange kinship, a silent acknowledgement that some shared understanding existed among those who had been seen and survived. The alley twisted deeper, and the ambient sounds of the lower habs, the drip of condensation, the distant clatter of machinery, the faint hum of electricity, took on a different quality refracted through the lens of observation. Time itself seemed to stretch and compress, moments lingering unnaturally, as if the golden presence threaded through them, making each second both infinite and inconsequential. He understood now why those who returned from custodian encounters spoke in hushed tones, why some avoided certain districts entirely, and why fear and awe were inseparable in the hearts of the marked. The Custodes did not merely act, they inscribed. They measured, observed, and transformed the very essence of those who crossed their path. He continued onward, deeper into the city's labyrinthine corridors, moving toward a sector whispered to harbor others who had been seen. Each turn brought new reminders, discarded belongings arranged unnaturally, shadows that paused longer than physics allowed, faint traces of ritual markings etched in corrosion. It was a world shaped by the invisible weight of observation, and every inhabitant carried its imprint in posture, gesture, and silence. In the faces he passed, he glimpsed echoes of his own experience, subtle, often imperceptible, yet unmistakably present. Here, survival was not merely a matter of life and death, but of perception, alignment, and endurance under scrutiny beyond comprehension. The courier understood, finally, that the Custodes' judgment was not punishment, nor mercy, nor cruelty. It was existence itself measured, calibrated, and catalogued. To be seen was to bear witness to a power beyond mortal reckoning, to be altered by observation in ways that would ripple through every subsequent choice, every fleeting thought, every heartbeat. And as he pressed deeper into the enclave of those marked by the golden gaze, he knew that his own path was irrevocably intertwined with forces larger than any mortal mind could contain, carrying the silent weight of the Emperor's will, the inevitability of judgment, and the terrifying certainty that being seen was a fate both absolute and incomprehensible. The enclave was a patchwork of survival, a hidden network of hab units, abandoned maintenance chambers, and makeshift shelters stacked in defiance of gravity and decay. Those who had been seen moved among it with the calm precision of beings who understood that their lives were measured not only by their actions but by the quiet, invisible awareness that lingered over them. They spoke in gestures and glances, a subtle language honed to avoid drawing unnecessary attention, for even here, in the relative safety of secrecy, the Custodes' reach seemed to pulse in the very air. The courier noticed the patterns immediately, the way a hand rested lightly on a rusted conduit, the careful pacing of footsteps, the slight tilt of the head before every turn. These were not affectations. They were the marks of survival, the traces left by those who had been observed and permitted to continue. A woman moved past, her eyes fixed on the ground, yet her awareness radiated outward, a silent echo of the custodian's measure. He realized then that they were all part of an unspoken continuum, a living ledger inscribed by judgment and continued existence. Each carried a subtle authority, a quiet gravity that distinguished them from the unmarked throngs of humanity still scuttling through Terra's lower levels. He passed a small communal area where data slates and fragments of old cogitator screens were repurposed into an improvised archive. A man sat hunched over a console, fingers dancing across the interface with precise, deliberate movements. Every command, every input, seemed intentional beyond mere necessity, as though each action were a testament to survival under observation. The courier felt a pang of recognition. This meticulousness, this constant calculation, was the mark of having been seen. To live under the invisible measure of the Custodes was to internalize their scrutiny, to carry it in posture, thought, and gesture. A soft clatter drew his attention to a distant corridor. He moved toward it cautiously, aware that even the slightest sound could betray a breach of unspoken protocol. Around him, others shifted imperceptibly, subtle gestures indicating the presence of a newcomer who had yet to fully integrate into the rhythms of observation. The courier realized that he, too, was now part of this pattern. His breaths were measured, his movements deliberate, each step a test of alignment with the invisible order that governed these halls. To falter, even momentarily, would not just risk attention, it would signal inadequacy in the ledger of existence itself. At the corridor's end, a figure waited, partially obscured by shadows cast from overhead conduits. The courier froze instinctively, sensing the weight of authority emanating not from weapons or stature, but from something far older, far more absolute, the aura of having been marked. The figure did not move immediately, allowing the courier to approach, observing each step with an almost imperceptible calculation. And in that moment the courier felt the full import of what it meant to belong to this hidden order. He was not alone, yet he was not truly free. To be seen was to be known was to be weighed, and to be weighed was to exist under a standard that surpassed understanding. The figure finally spoke, a voice low and even, almost more felt than heard. Words were deliberate, carefully chosen, each one resonating with the authority of lived experience under observation. "You have been marked," it said simply. No explanation followed, for none was necessary. Recognition carried more weight than argument, and the courier understood instantly. He had crossed a threshold. From ignorance to awareness, from survival as chance to survival as measured outcome. Every nerve, every thought, every micro-expression would now be part of the constant calculation that governed those who had been seen. He nodded subtly, acknowledging the truth without question. Around him, the enclave continued its quiet rhythms, the inhabitants moving in silent synchrony, each action measured and recorded in ways that defied mortal perception. Even in this hidden space, the custodian's influence lingered, an omnipresent reminder that to live was to be observed, to act was to be catalogued, and to exist was to carry the imprint of judgment in every gesture. And as the courier stepped further into the enclave, he realized that this existence, tenuous, perilous, and wholly defined by unseen eyes, was now his reality. To be seen was not merely a state of survival. It was a transformation, a permanent alignment with forces that no human mind could ever fully grasp. The courier moved deeper into the enclave, each step reverberating softly against the cold, metallic floors. Every corner, every shadow, seemed alive with the memory of those who had passed before him. Men and women whose lives had been silently measured, whose fates had been shaped by the unseen balance of custodian scrutiny. The air was thick with the scent of heated metal, burnt lubricants, and the faint, almost imperceptible tang of fear refined into vigilance. Here he realized, survival was not merely a matter of avoiding harm. It was the quiet cultivation of alignment with a presence that transcended understanding. In one corner, a small group of marked individuals huddled around a flickering data slate. Their faces were calm, yet each movement, each gesture, carried the imprint of observation. Fingers hovered over controls with meticulous precision, eyes scanned patterns with a deliberate patience, and even the rhythm of their breathing seemed regulated, as though echoing some unseen metronome. The courier recognized it instinctively. Those who had been seen carried not only memory but discipline, an internalized structure that reflected the custode's own unwavering exactitude. To be alive among them was to participate in a system that demanded attention to the smallest detail of thought and action. He passed a narrow passage where light barely reached, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, forming subtle patterns along the walls. A man moved silently ahead, his posture rigid yet fluid, a living testament to the balance between caution and presence. The courier could feel the faint pull of recognition, an acknowledgement without word or gesture. It was an understanding forged in the crucible of observation. To exist here was to be measured continually, and to survive was to demonstrate consistency with an authority that could never be questioned. Every step became a meditation, every glance a calculation. Even the act of standing still was deliberate, an expression of controlled presence. A faint hum of machinery drew his attention upward, where a partially collapsed conduit spilled steam into the corridor. The mist twisted in the dim light, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate, shadows bending as though acknowledging the patterns of the custode's unseen gaze. He realized that even the environment had become part of the continuum, a subtle extension of the judgment that tracked him. The lower habs were no longer random or chaotic. They were a living, breathing mirror of surveillance, a domain in which every vibration, every flicker of light, every motion of air reflected the invisible scales of scrutiny. The courier's awareness deepened, every sense sharpened, attuned to signals that had once gone unnoticed. He paused at a junction, the enclave opening into a wider chamber where others gathered. Their presence was quiet but resolute, the cohesion of those who had survived observation made evident in the small, measured interactions that took place. No words were spoken aloud. Even casual conversation had been replaced by gestures, subtle eye movements, and the silent alignment of posture. To be seen was to be recorded, not only by memory but by subtle mimicry of expectation. behavior internalized to satisfy a standard that could neither be argued with nor ignored. He understood that he had entered a community defined not by geography but by the invisible calculus of judgment, an order whose laws were imposed without speech or ceremony. As he moved through the chamber, a faint golden gleam reflected from a shard of polished metal, catching his eye. For an instant, he thought he saw the echo of the custodian's helm in its surface, impossibly perfect, impossibly absolute. He shook the thought away, telling himself it was reflection, illusion, or fatigue. Yet, the lingering sensation of being measured remained, pressing against his mind and body with the subtle insistence of inevitability. Every heartbeat seemed to carry weight, every breath a measure. In that moment he realized fully the truth of what it meant to be seen. It was not merely observation but transformation. To be seen was to enter a continuum that reshaped perception, action, and even thought, embedding him within a framework of awareness as ancient and unyielding as the Emperor's own throne. He moved on, deeper into the enclave, each step carrying the silent acknowledgement of all who had come before and all who would come after. To survive was not simply to evade death, it was to internalize a rhythm imposed by forces beyond comprehension, a pattern that would persist long after the corridors had been abandoned and the shadows receded. The custodian's presence, though unseen, had become part of the fabric of his existence, and the courier understood with a chilling clarity that there was no return to ignorance. To be seen was to live forever under scrutiny, a state both terrifying and absolute, and one that would shape every choice he made, every action he took, for as long as he walked the corridors of Terra. The enclave seemed to pulse with a quiet life of its own, the rhythm of survival echoing in every corridor, every shadowed corner. The courier moved with deliberate care, acutely aware of how each gesture, each micro-adjustment in posture, could carry significance beyond his understanding. Here, being seen was no longer a simple occurrence, it had become the defining force of existence. Each breath, each glance, each step was woven into the continuum of observation, a tapestry that extended far beyond the physical walls of the under-habs. The golden presence lingered still, unseen yet undeniable, shaping perception and behavior in ways that no mortal law could enforce. He passed a small communal area where others were repairing damaged equipment, their movements exact and precise. Hands hovered over tools, adjustments made with careful attention, while eyes scanned data slates in near silence. There was a cohesion here, an unspoken discipline born not of hierarchy but of shared experience under observation. The courier recognized the traces of survival etched into every action, subtle shifts in weight, controlled breaths, measured gestures, all indicating that these individuals had been shaped, molded, and refined by the custode's silent scrutiny. They existed as living embodiments of judgment rendered, their very presence a testament to the relentless measure of those who had been seen. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated through the chamber, drawing the courier's attention upward. A panel of conduits, long neglected, had begun to vibrate with the flow of residual power. The mist of condensation caught the flickering light, refracting it into shifting patterns that seemed almost intentional, like symbols placed for his guidance or warning. He knew instinctively that in this place, even the environment could be a reflection of the golden gaze, responding to and shaping the behaviors of those who moved within it. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every subtle sound was imbued with significance, a language he was only beginning to understand. In the center of the chamber, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with quiet certainty. The courier felt the familiar, almost tactile pressure of recognition. This was not merely a person but another who had been observed, shaped, and permitted to continue. Their movements were deliberate, precise, and yet infused with a calm awareness of the unseen measure that governed every action. He understood that this was the true mark of survival under custodian scrutiny, not strength, nor cunning, nor even cleverness, but the ability to exist in alignment with forces beyond comprehension, to carry the imprint of observation within one's very being. The figure's gaze met his for a fraction of a moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. No words were necessary, experience and presence conveyed more than speech could ever achieve. The courier felt a strange reassurance, tempered with awe and fear. He was no longer alone in this continuum of perception. There were others, a hidden network of those who had been seen and allowed to remain, living embodiments of the measure that had touched him. And yet, the certainty of being observed remained, a constant, unyielding force threading through every thought and action. To be seen was not a singular event, it was a permanent alignment with judgment, a redefinition of self in the light of scrutiny that never faded. He continued, moving deeper into the enclave, each step a meditation on survival and perception. The air itself seemed denser, filled with the quiet resonance of lives lived under the golden gaze. Even in silence, the presence of the custodes was felt, shaping behavior and thought with subtle insistence. To exist here was to embrace a paradox: freedom within constraint, life within measure, and agency within the certainty of observation. And as he moved forward, the courier understood fully that being seen was not a danger that could be escaped. It was a transformation that would endure, woven into every decision, every gesture, every fleeting thought for the remainder of his existence. In the quiet, controlled rhythm of the enclave, he had become one of those who were seen, a living testament to the inexorable weight of judgment and the unyielding certainty of survival under the golden shadow.